And we're rolling. Ron, how you doing?
Good evening, Daniel. I'm great, thanks. Yourself?
I'm very good, thanks. Ron Addinall is a psychotherapist at UCT. Is that right, Ron?
Great, yeah. So I'm a full-time academic at UCT in the Department of Social Development. We are trained social workers and clinical social workers as psychotherapists. And then I'm also a sexologist and sex therapist.
Okay, and I suppose I wanted to ask you how you got into this type of work, and when did it become a passion?
Okay. So when, just to check down, and when you say this kind of work, we're talking about the sexuality broadly, and then I'll speak towards the issue of trans or gender identity, which is what I will be focusing on this evening, right?
Correct. So I had a podcast with Melissa, and
Mhm.
so Melissa Cuts is it's one of the podcasts that the viewers are probably familiar with. And after we chatted, I it became clear that there was sort of more to talk about and a lot more to cover actually. And you were the she pointed me in your direction, saying you were the right guy to talk to. And I suppose really at the heart of it, and what I want to know is uh, why does it take so long for equal rights? I mean, we live in 2020 and we live in a civilized society, most of the world. Why why do some people have more rights than others? Um, why does it take so long for people to get rights? So and I look back at sort of gay rights and how long it took for gay people to just have the same rights as everybody else. And I think the next step is obviously transgender rights. And
Mm.
what's interesting to me is why people are motivated to put a break on human rights and why.
Right.
Well, I mean, if you look at a trans person and you don't see a human being looking back at you, I mean, there's something wrong with you, right? So that is
I would
where,
agree with that, yes.
yeah. So that is why I wanted to have a conversation with you today, and I suppose that is the background to the conversation. And so when I ask how you got into this type of work, yeah, I was talking about the psychotherapy, and you were also a sexologist at one point. So give us a little bit of a story of your background
Okay,
and how it led up
sure.
to what you do today.
Yeah, well, so in high school, I already knew I wanted to work with people. I wanted to help people. I was the kid that everyone always came to speak to when they were going through tough, difficult times. I knew I had a natural inclination towards wanting to be helpful. I was also, as a teenager, very much involved in youth work, etc., and youth related to church. So I went and studied social work. So that was my, my base career. Went to Stellenbosch University and studied social work, specifically because I like the fact that social workers, work with communities, they worked with groups of people, they worked with individuals as well. And also the profession had as its base, fighting for the rights of the most vulnerable people in society, challenging poverty, challenging, discrimination and prejudice. So it was a profession that I felt workers just, let me loose on the world and I'm going to fix and heal everyone.
Okay.
And I remember I got my first period of employment. I was a military social worker. So I was employed by the South African National Defence Force, and I was based at Acerplot Air Force Base. And I remember on the second day of me working as a professional social worker, I was told they had booked a couple for me to see. And I was all excited because I'd been trained in doing marital counseling and couple counseling. And I remember we were 2 minutes into the session, and the wife pointed to her husband, looked at me, and said, "He wants to make me do things in bed that I don't want to do." And I remember sitting there
Sorry.
going, well, but that's
Not
an
funny.
appropriate response.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Then and I remember sitting there thinking, I think she's meaning sex.
Yeah.
And I was like going through my catalog, okay, what I've been taught. And the only thing that at that point in time came to mind was that I've been taught that HIV/AIDS was a sexually transmitted disease. And that was it.
They hadn't prepared you
And
for
I
that. Yeah.
remember but being well trained, I didn't want to know that's very interesting. I think you're talking about your sexuality. That's not something I think I'm trained to do. I'm going to refer you.
Right.
And then what played out is I tried to find fellow social work colleagues. I tried to refer to my psychology colleagues. I was tried to refer to my psychiatry colleagues. And every single one came back of those of my colleague groupings and said, nope, We're not qualified. No one here is comfortable with addressing sexual issues. And so literally from the second day of my career, I was confronted with this blind spot. Like, why can't I refer anyone? And I remember going to my textbook and there was chapters on dealing with sexual issues. And it became very clear to me at this stage that there was this blind spot. I wasn't being taught, and neither were my fellow healthcare practitioners. So that's kind of right at the beginning where it started. And then I realized, and when I did the research, that there's this entire field called sexology and sex therapy. So I got interested, and I was getting more and more clients and more young people I was working with that were facing all kinds of sexual issues and struggles and insecurities. And that's how my training in sex therapy and sexology began. And typically in South Africa, the moment you become known in a niche area that is a source of a lot of discomfort for everyone else, you become the go-to person. So I just started getting more and more people wanting to, consult and get referred to me. And so I was given the privilege of starting a sexual health clinic at 2 Military Hospital in Wynberg. So I can still famously claim I started the first ever sexual health clinic in a military environment in the world.
Wow.
And I started the sexual health clinic where I would see individuals and couples that were experiencing a wide range of sexual problems. I also did sexual health education. So I'd go to the different wards because there's a link between various, medical conditions and medications and surgeries that affect sexual functioning. And I also then developed a introduction to human sexuality workshop where I would go around the country teaching healthcare practitioners on at least how to assess a client that's having a sexual challenge or sexual problem, and then to refer to the clinic. So the clinic was running for about 2 years at 2 Military Hospital. And at that stage, the moment and I remember this, as the sexologist and the sex therapist, patients really wanted to greet you in public because they would immediately assume if they're greeting you and everyone knows you're the sex therapist, everyone's going to think they have a sexual problem.
Right.
So you kind of become this person that people look at, kind of with curiosity and interest and all kinds of, and I remember, even I had a psychiatrist once say to me, why am I always suspicious of people that are sexologists and sex therapists? This is a professionally trained healthcare practitioner.
Right.
To which thankfully I'm well enough trained. I said, well, I'm not quite sure why you feel that way. You should maybe go get some therapy and try and figure it out.
Maybe she has some problems that she needs to talk about.
It was a man. It was a male psychiatrist.
And that's very sexist of me to assume it was a woman. I'm already in trouble.
Good catch, Daniel. Good catch. Anyway, so what happened? So that was going for a while, and then so I kind of became known as the moment a client is dealing with something that's kind of out of the ordinary, you send them to Ron. That literally became my reputation.
Yeah.
And so this brings us to how transgender work and gender identity came to me. So literally I got a referral. It was, I think, the second year of the clinic, where a Air Force person had come to our psychiatry department and had informed the psychiatrist that it was a biological or a person assigned male at birth, so born biologically male. And had informed the psychiatrist that she had always, through her life, experienced herself to be a woman, and that, that within herself, she's always identified as and felt that she actually was a woman. And she had now gotten to a point in her life where she could no longer repress this and avoid it. She even, she tried the whole thing of like becoming the alpha military person as a way to think that maybe that would make it go away, which of course it didn't. And of course the psychiatrist was overwhelmed. So they went, oh, we'll send you to Ronald. And so I remember, this is like almost 20 years ago.
He can
where
fix
I found
anybody.
myself, sorry?
He can fix anybody.
Well, just because it's strange, so we'll just end it there. What happens is I don't think they necessarily even cared. This is about 20 years ago, and I found myself sitting across this woman, and I acknowledged my trans clients immediately by the gender they identify. Right. But at that stage, I was this naive, young, sex therapist and clinical social worker, because I also specialized as a clinical social worker in that time. So I've trained as a psychotherapist as well. You'll notice by now I get bored very quickly, so I'm always learning new things. But I sat across from her and she told me her story. And I remember saying to her, you know, I have absolutely no idea how to help you. And I also have absolutely no idea where to send you. And, you know, I did do some inquiries, and similarly to my wanting to send a client just for basic sex therapy, there was no one previously. I knew that there was no help, or no, I wasn't aware of any services, and there weren't any.
Okay.
So I said to her, I want to help you, and that you and I are going to have to figure this out together. And so I started a journey with my very first trans client where we did the research. She helped me with the research. We got the international literature. We brought all the international kind of then existing standards of care together. And we figured out her, you know, what the intervention for her was going to need to be. I got our occupational therapist involved so she could help her with the social transition to start living as a woman. I got our head of endocrinology involved so that he could then do the necessary work so that she could go on gender affirming hormones. And yeah, at that stage, gender affirming surgery was not yet on the cards because you know, that would take a while. She has since, for many years now, she's already had her gender affirming surgery and lives as a woman for many years. But yeah, so my journey with her, so that's how, so my point is it found me.
Right.
It's not something I kind of at some point thought, oh, I think this is interesting. Let me go and investigate it. It literally, you know, she landed in my office.
Okay.
And I was absolutely, you know, I just found what I learned through her about, you know, being a person, and a person just so clearly, and people often still today, when they hear that I work in the field of gender identity, they go, it's so complex. It's actually not complex at all. If a person knows within their core of who they are, you know, that they are a woman, there's nothing complicated about that. The challenge is that she was assigned female at birth and she was born in a biological, you know, male body, but her experience of herself, and often cisgender people, which is the term for a person who their gender they experience themselves to be and the gender they were born matches up and they're comfortable.
Yeah.
Often when I'm talking to cisgender persons, I'll say, well, you know, let's say someone like yourself, and I'll say some to you like Daniel. So when did you know you were a man?
Right. I mean,
can you answer that?
I would say when I was about, my earliest memory is when I was either 2 or 3, and I think I already knew I was a man. It's open for debate whether I mean, whether I feel like one today or not. But so she was assigned a male at birth, and
Yeah.
but she knew she was a woman inside.
Woman. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, I mean, you're even showing that you've progressed more as, you know, and I'm being stereotypical here now, as men. You actually took a reflective moment. The response I most often get when I ask cisgender people, you know, when did you first realize you were a male or a female? And they go, what do you mean?
Yeah.
I've always known. But what kind of a question is that?
And I think
and then I go, exactly. So
Yeah.
that experience.
Oh, sorry, I
just in a biological body.
was gonna say, I think it is like just the lack of introspection that people have to look inside themselves is exactly why things take so long in society to move and just to progress. And you know,
the same thing comes with heterosexuality and homosexuality. Often when I would be dealing with that, I'll ask straight people, so when did you come out as straight? When did you know you were straight?
Right.
You know, then you often get like, what do you mean? I just am. So exactly. So if you just know you're straight, why would you question and challenge someone who knows they're gay, for example, or bisexual, or omnisexual, or pansexual? But we do live in a world where if you're cisgender and you are, you know, heterosexual, you know, the theme of conversation that we're dealing a lot with at the moment is privilege. You know, you have white privilege, for example, but there's also, you know, heteronormative, you know, privilege as well, that influences. So if you're cisgender and you're heterosexual, you're normal, and anything outside of that is immediately othered and made a pathology.
right. But, so
we'll
normal.
talk about it later.
Yeah, normal's a bad word to use. So is that why they use the word heteronormative?
Yes, because heteronormative, because the heterosexuality in the paradigm is deemed that is the norm.
Right.
That's normal. And
Okay.
then outside of that, it's then obviously pathologized. So
Yeah.
yeah, so I worked with her and she transitioned. And then so typically in South Africa, then she told people that she knew, and then more people asked to come in to our clinic for counseling. I got permission from the military to see private patients as well. Then most of my initial clients were mostly trans women and then later trans men. So those are persons assigned female at birth, but their core central internal gender identity is male.
Okay.
And as that evolved, I was approached by Triangle Project, which is, I think, an important LGBTQIA non-for-profit organization to know about. It's the oldest LGBTQIA NPO in South Africa. So they approached me because they knew the work that I was doing, whether I would then offer, volunteer counseling for them, which I then started to do as well, where for them I would see transgender individuals, work with their families as well. So once they come out, now some of my clients were married, some had children, and of course they have families. So I'd bring in their partners, bring in their children, bring in the families, and offer that kind of support as well.
Amazing.
And then also it developed into, now they needed to transition at work, if they were at university. So I would then advocate. That's, where my social work side always comes in. So I would then go with my clients to their places of work to negotiate that they can now live as, or kind of present as the gender they experience themselves to be at work. And then that kept growing, where I then started seeing more and more gender non-conforming people and gender non-binary identified persons on the gender spectrum. I ran one of the kind of the longest existing transgender support groups. I ran it at Triangle Project. I ran it for 14 years. I handed it over at the end of last year. And then that evolved further now in the last 5 years, where more and more parents are aware of gender identity. There's a lot more known now than when I started out 20 years ago. There's much more research. There's a lot more knowledge. There are a lot more international organizations, a lot more good evidence-based science and research has been done. A lot more international healthcare bodies, are up to date. And so we are now at the point where, so I'm now working a lot with transgender children and transgender adolescents, which is quite still fairly for many people, a controversial area. But yeah, so parents are identifying and recognizing their transgender kids a lot earlier today. And there's an organization called WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, it's an international entity that looks at the best scientific, evidence-based healthcare practices in working with transgender children, adolescents, and adults. So in South Africa, those of us that now do work in the field, we follow the international standards. Okay. We're not just doing our own thing. And it's in the WPATH Standards of Care version 7, which we are working with at the moment, where for the appropriately assessed transgender child, we facilitate social transition. For the appropriately assessed transgender adolescent beginning puberty, we will now pause their puberty. It's not gender affirming hormones and surgery that's making irreversible changes. It just presses pause so that they can just continue kind of, stabilizing and living within their body. And so that they don't go through, because can you imagine if you're a girl and you start, getting a deep voice and growing a beard, and if you identify as a boy and have your body starts changing and you're developing breasts, you're going to have severe, gender dysphoria and body dysphoria. So we're able to help teenagers today. We can pause their puberty, and only when they get to the age of 18 do we bring about the more permanent type of gender affirming treatments of hormones and surgery.
Okay.
So I went from sitting across a trans woman 20 years ago to literally navigating the entire spectrum of transgender healthcare.
Okay, and so I do want to come back to sort of children and adolescent transgender people, but and their rights and how we sort of go about looking at those. But just on the trans woman that was your sort of first trans client, up until that point, you obviously you were seeing people with sexual problems and sometimes medical conditions that you could take medicine for, but other times medical conditions where you needed surgery. So, what were the type of things you were dealing with, and why was the trans person sent to you? You must have been a bit surprised when when the trans woman was sent to you. Now you have a client where you actually don't know how to help them. But I just wanted to sort of touch on the issues, the type of issues. We don't have to go into like
Sure. I think
into
the
hectic
reason that,
detail, but yeah.
sure. Now, the reason she was sent to me is because I basically merged two areas. So because I'm a clinical social worker, so I've trained in the field of mental health, and so at 2 Military Hospital where I had the clinic, I was also, because I trained as a clinical social worker, I worked in our psychiatric department. I was part of the psychiatry multidisciplinary team. So I was also working with clients that had various psychiatric and mental disorders. And at that time, because this is pre-2013, not to age myself too much, but pre-2013, there was a diagnosis in the field of psychiatry called gender identity disorder. So before 2013, if you were transgender, you were diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder. So that's why she ended up going to the psychiatry department and saw a psychiatrist first. But then, and this is also we'll see if this kind of becomes part of the conversation at that time, and it still exists as a challenge today, is people still conflate or confuse or kind of mix sexual orientation and gender identity. So when the psychiatrist sat across from her at that time, and she was talking about being, that she's a woman within, many times people say, well, maybe you're just an effeminate boy, maybe you're just gay, because one of the theories was this was someone that couldn't come to terms with the fact that they were gay. I mean, this is just how crazy some of the theories were. So now you would transition to become a woman so that you don't have to deal with the fact that you're gay. I mean, it's so crazy. But anyway, that kind of mindset existed because people didn't understand, like we do today, that your gender identity and your sexual orientation are two completely separate, independent aspects of who you are as a person.
Right.
So why she was referred to me, so there I represent the field of human sexuality and I represent the field of mental health. And so I was deemed, and also they didn't know where to send her, and I had the reputation of that is unusual, send to Ron.
Okay, right. And I think that answered my question where I was sort of wondering, because obviously you're not a urologist, so there's no like mechanical things that you're helping with. It's all psychological, mental, and what's the other word? Clinical.
Yeah, but I do, as a sexologist, I work on what's known as the psychosocial part of the spectrum, so the psychological and the social.
Yeah.
But I'm also trained in understanding the medical. So I'm always part of a multidisciplinary team. So for example, in the sexology side of things, if I was dealing with a man with erectile dysfunction and he had high blood pressure and diabetes, for example, because those are two medical conditions, as well as the medical treatment for high blood pressure, for example, can cause erectile dysfunction in men.
Okay.
So I would do the assessment and then I would refer my client to the urologist, and the urologist and I would work together. The urologist would, for example, then prescribe a PEDE5, the Viagra's of the world. And I will then continue the therapeutic, emotional, psychological, and social treatment of the client together with them using, for example, Viagra as a medication. So
Okay.
I'm always part of a multidisciplinary team in most of the work that I do, which is wonderful.
That's interesting, yeah. And so you would also work with how do they sort of deal with the problem with their partner, and so that it doesn't become a massive thing socially that weighs them down and leads them to depression and all other sorts of worse problems. So,
but there's a wide range. So there's also sexual problems that aren't medical. So for example, I dealt with a lot of women that were anorgasmic, that, never experienced orgasms and struggled to achieve orgasms. And there was no medical reason for it. It was just they grew up in a society that, raised women not to really celebrate and appreciate their bodies and their sexuality. If you're as a girl getting raised most of your life, don't touch that, that is dirty. Then you go through menstruation that has all kinds of, things hanging over it, and good girls do this and bad girls do that.
Right.
It was in that, it's a lot better now, but at that time, I mean, how many women by the time they got to marriage, had never masturbated, didn't know how to give themselves an orgasm. And then men get raised to think like, you take the lead, men just know what to do. And of course, what men actually know about a woman's,
Very little.
anatomy and, the clitoris is a mystery for many men still. So then there wasn't any medical treatment. It was me literally sitting with couples and teaching a man about the clitoris and giving the woman permission to explore her body and enjoy her body and figure out what works for her, so that she could teach her partner, and so that they could obviously develop a happy, sexual relationship, and she could overcome her anorgasmia, for example. But yeah, so that was the sexology, sex therapy side.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting to me, and I think another area I wanted to touch on and just see, find out a bit more about it is when you were. So you talked about advocacy and the social work of getting someone back into the workplace. Maybe you aren't really allowed to share this information, but what were the more difficult things, and were there any standout cases of strange behavior from people at the workplace that actually, held back progress?
I can share narratives without. So let me go. So I dealt with people that were trans in major corporations. So where I probably experienced my most challenges, for example, were like so one of a trans woman I worked with, and that's not going to disclose much, was a train driver. And so I had to deal with the South African Rail Service. And so I had to negotiate with obviously the management. And so a lot of the challenges I would get is they would kind of do the legalistic, well, she's not a woman yet, until she has the surgery, and you deal with all of these, and we won't call her by her female name, and but the South Africa for me is wonderful for many reasons. But one of the advantages that we have, and I think maybe South Africa, I don't know in your podcast if this has come up in other talks, but we are so blessed to have the constitution that we have.
Right.
We have, as we know, one of the most well-crafted liberal constitutions in the world. A constitution that clearly articulates you may not discriminate, amongst other things, based on gender and sexual orientation. So our constitution, and that includes protection for trans women and trans men. You cannot discriminate against trans men and trans women because it's their gender.
Does the Constitution state gender identity, or do you assume that gender is protected? It doesn't matter. Yeah.
It doesn't state gender identity in its brief summary, but when you unpack the clarifications, it
in a court of law,
does.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, it covers. So I would get a lot of resistance. It's a lot more challenging in our kind of predominantly kind of patriarchal environment to transition for a person assigned male at birth to transition to a woman. I mean, I think there's just in the collective unconscious of, kind of male dominant, corporate is like, how the hell, why would a man want to give up the privilege of being male, and want to transition, into woman? So, or be the woman that she experiences herself to be. So, so I was confronted in the beginning a lot with the fact that people lacked education. And I would deal with kind of the religious discriminatory, but this is against God and
not what God
nature.
wants. Yeah.
And then they would do the whole legalistic. Well, our HR, regulations say A, B, and C. But me being, and thank you to my trainers, I trained at Stellenbosch University and at UCT. They trained me as a good social worker, so I did my homework. Right. So often my first engagements to advocate for my clients was for me to challenge them legally and say, actually, if you do not actually support your employee, you are breaking the law. So I had to kind of do that confrontation, but try and do it in a way. But, besides that, I'm here to want to help you. Then the other thing that maybe a lot of people don't know is we have the alteration of Sex Description and Sex Status Act, Act 49 of, and I always forget the year, 2007 or something like that. So that's another very liberal act that South Africa has. We're one of the few countries in the world that has, so the Alteration of Sex Status and Sex Description Act is the act that legally makes it possible for a transgender person to apply to have their gender legally corrected on their birth certificate. And once they've gone to that process, they are legally the man and or woman that they now are living as and who they identify as. So I had the Constitution, I had the Alteration of Sex Description and Sex Status Act on my side. So I could very quickly address the kind of the legal resistance. But the kind of person I am, I worked very hard in kind of trying to win people over and saying, this isn't, someone doesn't just wake up one morning and say, maybe life would be interesting to live as a man. Let me go and live as a man or a woman. I mean, so I would do a lot of the kind of the psychoeducation with the management teams. Normally with my trans client by my side, because I will have empowered him or her to also have their own voice, because I also believe it's not my place to speak on the behalf of my trans clients. They're quite capable of speaking for themselves. They're obviously just afraid, and they need the support, and they need people to champion together with them. So often it would be my trans clients and I sitting together, and I would represent the voice of science and the voice of evidence and the voice, and I need to challenge that as much as we can respect people's cultural beliefs and we can respect people's religious beliefs, and that's absolutely fine. But we live in South Africa, we're a secular state. You cannot let cultural and religious beliefs dictate what happens in the workplace or in a school, or in a higher, a tertiary institution. Yeah. So I would have the legal backup, try and win them over. And then, but then I would offer the service. Then I'll do in-service training for the staff that are working with the trans clients. We would actually have sessions together. And as much as I faced resistance, fairly soon after I started doing the work, things already started to change. And I can tell you that in all the years, I would put it now that 85% of the times now, people and for quite some time have been open and said, we don't know, we don't understand, we want to help, teach us, educate us. I've had significantly more positive experiences in various contexts, including, schools and universities, obviously, because they are more liberal, and both in government and in private sector environments, where immediately the HR person is brought on board, they update their HR policies if they need to do so, and create a welcoming, environment. And so many of my clients, having their colleagues more often than not coming up to them and saying, we're so happy you've taken us into your confidence. We are so proud of you. This is incredibly brave of you to do. And more often than not, having supportive reactions than
well that's already a win, because then you don't have to sort of, like you said, win them over, because they're already welcoming, and then there doesn't have to be like a battle, or like, okay, we're going to do a legal battle now, and then socially it's awkward and they're going to resent the person because now they've been in some sort of legal situation with them. So that's cool. I wanted to touch on, you said so there's a few so we probably not 100% clear on the terminology, and I think the listeners feel the same way. A large portion of my listeners might be the guys I play sport with. So when you said and or, like a man and or a woman, what does gender non-binary mean, and is it possible to, why did you say and or?
Okay, sure. So what we need to understand, so the easy way is gender is a spectrum. That's the one way to kind of, and if you kind of actually, but I'm going to simplify it. So if you think, as with most things in life, it's on a spectrum. So we know sexual orientation is on a spectrum. No one is absolutely 100% heterosexual and absolutely 100% homosexual. We're all somewhere on the spectrum, and I can see you smiling, but that's a fact.
Okay.
Now, gender identity is the same. It's a spectrum.
Yeah.
And so a trans man, a person who identifies as a trans man, means even though they were born biologically and assigned female at birth because of their genetic coding and the anatomy of their body, they experience themselves in every sense to be a man, and they want to live fully as a man. And they want to use male pronouns, have a male name, wear male clothes, take testosterone to masculinize their body, and may want to have, for example, chest surgery to masculinize their chest, etc. They want to live and be seen as and express themselves as male. And for trans women, that would be, and this is what I must be careful to do. It's not the opposite, because this is the other shocking truth. Male is not the opposite of female. Male is a gender. Female is a gender, and they're on this spectrum. So gender non-conforming are persons who they don't necessarily identify as another gender. Let's say for myself, I'm male, biologically male. I've been assigned male. I'm okay with that, but I'm not typically male. There are things, maybe there's things, way I like to dress, clothes I like to wear, activities that I really enjoy that maybe my culture says, or my social context says, well, that's kind of femme or female. And that would mean I'm gender non-conforming, and I would want to feel I have the right to wear what I want and do what I like, but
Okay.
I don't identify as another gender. So that's the gender non-conforming. Then your gender non-binary are the persons in their gender identity. They often experience kind of a combination, and that's why we need to understand the spectrum idea. And this is just, I'm really doing this just for simplification, okay? So
Yes,
I'm
because
making
at the
crude examples.
yes, because at the
So you'll
beginning of
have
the
someone that will say, for me, it's an 80-20.
I got
It's
it.
80% masculine, 20% femme. For some, it's a 70-30. For some, it's a 50-50. And whatever that combination may be can also be different to their biological body. So I can be biologically male, and it can be, 70 female, 30 male, or 80-20,
Yeah.
or the other way around. That's why I always have that caveat, because there are literally a spectrum of genders. And then you also get people who identify as agender,
Okay.
meaning they don't identify to have a gender at all. Um, their sense of their identity is more kind of neutral in relation to within themselves feeling I'm actually more male or masculine or female or feminine or a blend of it. I'm actually none of that, kind of resonates with my sense of my identity, and they would then identify as agender.
Yeah. So I think what I wanted to say was in the beginning of the podcast, we sort of touched on the fact that you said, people say to you that's extremely complicated, and you say, no, it's actually really simple. So I think where they think it's complicated is where the spectrum comes in, because
Yeah.
then there's a lot of words you got to learn, or there's a lot of terminology you got to learn if you are heteronormative, or,
Yeah.
so these are things I want to learn. And then,
I get, just to then clarify, I guess it's complicated when you don't have the knowledge, absolutely. But the actual people think being trans, the identity thing, it's some complicated internal thing that's
okay,
going
I
on
got
for the
you.
person. That's where they're very clear about once they've figured out where on the gender spectrum they are, knowing that is not complicated for the person who experiences it.
Okay, I
That's what I
understand.
meant.
And
So they're not, because some people think, these people, I often hear people say, oh, shame, it's so sad. I'm like, firstly, I don't know why you're saying it's sad, because most of my transplants are the most, interesting out there, can have a good time and just are so empowered in knowing who they are. There's nothing sad about my trans clients that I've worked with through the years.
yeah.
Um, and and they're so clear about who they are. The challenge for them is the fact that we still tend to live predominantly in families and in cultures and in social context where the knowledge is not yet pervasive.
Yeah.
And so who they are, so the challenges trans people face, and why there's a higher, for example, statistical incidence of depression and anxiety and suicidality, amongst trans persons, is not because inside of them they're so tortured about the, their gender identity. They know who they are. It is the fact that they face families and communities who tell you you're a freak, you're a nothing, you're disgusting. You get thrown out of your family, you get thrown out of your church or your religious congregation who've been your family, who've been your community, and now tell you that you're demonic, or you're sick, or you're perverted. So the suffering is primarily because of how they are being discriminated against, and the prejudice and the hate that they face in the content. That's what makes it complex and complicated, not their gender identity.
Okay. And I think, to a lesser degree, there's also guys like me that want to learn more about it. We also get backlash from activists because we might say something wrong, or express ourselves in the incorrect way. That's why I'm trying to be careful today, and I'm trying to be respectful. But there is a lot of heat on the subject, and that brings me to my next point, which is children and adolescents. So it's a topic where there's so much heat, not a lot of light. I think I am very much like a type of guy that wants to protect children, and I know there's one case in the UK where there was a person who was assigned female at birth, trans, but the child thought that she was a man, and then transitioned to a man, and then decided that she had made a mistake and she was actually a woman, but she did the whole transition. So what I suppose what I want to say is, what is the right, and this is why I've got you on actually today, because I think you've got the best answers for these type of questions. What is the right age to transition? And take us through because there's obviously behavioral and the social acceptance of your parents, your family, the community. Then there's hormonal, and this is where we start to introduce hormones, chemicals, medicine. I'm not sure how it works. I mean, you're the expert. And then there's the scalpel. There's actually physically changing things. So what's the right age? I mean, this is a debate that could go on forever. And I mean, I don't want to make it a political thing, left and right. I just want to get a bit more clarity on the issue.
And I'll jump in on that. So the first thing to speak about, so the case that you refer to, the term that you'll hear they often talk about is, they call them, or the term that you'll come across on social media is the detransitioners.
Okay.
People who detransition. So now, of course, we've got to be so careful with how the media deals with things, because the media take something and they want to sell, space and time. So you can dramatize and almost catastrophize. So the first thing is, so there are people who, and I'll speak to that if we get the time, there are people who so-called, use the term, who detransition. Firstly, there are less than 1% of transgender persons who transition.
Okay.
So the first thing to say is, so yes, there are cases, and I'll speak to.
But I'm coming from a perspective where if a 4-year-old or 5-year-old,
I'll speak to you in a moment.
Do you know what I mean? So that's where I'm coming from.
But I just think that is important that it is understood. So detransition is something that happens for some people, but there are like 1 to less than 1% of people who actually transition.
Okay.
So I mean, there's like 99% of people who transition who just get on with their lives. It was the right thing for them to do, and they are absolutely happy and just get on with life.
100%.
So let's come to the children. So what we know about gender identity, so that's the term, gender identity, which is separate from your biological sex. So I think this is just important that we understand. So when conception happens, the ova is an X chromosome ova, and if it's a Y chromosome, sperm cell, it tells the egg you must now no longer become a biological female child, you must become a biological male child. If it's a X chromosome, it's carry on and become a biological, female child. So we have the chromosomal factor that influences biological sex. But again, so I need to go into this detail because I think people need to understand the complexity. Not at conception, not all children have an XXXY chromosome combination. You get XXY, XYY. There's a number of multiple
Yes.
other
There's
chromosomal
about 8. I think
combinations.
there's about 8 different ones, hey?
That could be, yeah. So those children, when they're born just from the chromosome point of view, will be born intersexed. So now intersexuality is different to gender identity. Intersex people and people who are transgender have similar journeys that they share because it obviously it has a lot to do with gender later. But anyway, we need to understand how complex we are as human beings, on all levels. So there's at the chromosome point, there's the spectrum. But even children that have the typical, let's say, XY chromosome combination, and now should become a biological boy child, male child. You can have a child, so now the chromosome is in place, but the child may have the fetus will have the unique phenomenon that it doesn't actually respond to the testosterone flushing. That now needs to further happen so that fetus that has an XY chromosomal, kind of template actually develops into a biological boy child. Because it doesn't respond to the testosterone, that's another factor that can result in the wide range of intersexuality. So you can have that child born with external genitalia that looks like female genitalia, but has an XY chromosome combination. So the biological variance is much wider than we as a general public understand and appreciate. That aside, let's say now we have a child, XY, XX chromosome, all is fine. We know that there's a point in the development of the fetus which is known as the gender typing of the brain. So there's a time in fetal development where there's significant hormone flushing that's happening as the fetus is growing, that's concentrated on the brain development of the child. And so what we understand and appreciate is that obviously there's such diversity that's happening. So the brain is forming its various parts, into to various degrees. The other analogy we often use is if we impregnate 4 women at exactly the same moment in time, and we followed that fetus every minute of every hour of every week of every month of the 9 months, no two, and I never know what the plural of fetus is, if it's fetuses or feti, but no two fetuses go through exactly the same experience within the womb. This is why we are all divinely unique as individuals. But what we do know, there's something that happens around brain development that sets a template for how, when we are born, we will naturally be in the world. Naturally, how we would walk, hold our body structure, the things that we are going to be drawn to. But we are born into a world that has social scripts of gender. Right. So we already know that, if mommy comes home and says, we're going to have a girl while she's pregnant, we already change how we interact with the pregnancy before the child's even there.
Different color in the room.
Carrying a girl, we speak in low, high tones, and we speak more softly. If it's a boy, we speak with louder voices and deeper. So the child arrives into the world that says, because you have a penis, this is how we're going to socialize you. Because you have a vagina, this is how we're going to socialize you. Right. But what we don't know is what is the already pre-existing template in that child. So we know that whatever a person's gender identity is going to be is already unalterably established in the womb and basically set by the age of 3, primarily based on our biology. So the old theories of, you end up being a trans woman because your mom actually wanted to have a little girl, or, it's another daughter, but daddy actually wanted to have a son. And now the the girl is kind of trying to be the boy that daddy always wanted. All of that theories have been debunked.
Okay.
You know, the nature nurture debate. But what we know today is that we are all born with an innate way we're going to move through the world, but the world genders everything. What we do find is that the largest percentage of people, how they naturally are, and the gender that's assigned to them because of their sex, there's a comfortable fit, and they will just go through life and identify as cisgender. Then there are children that, you know, depending on where on that spectrum they are, because remember, a child wants to be loved unconditionally. A child is tuned into its environment. You know, if the little baby crawls across and picks up the Barbie, and daddy in a very firm voice pulls the Barbie away and puts the little toy car down and says, no, boys don't play with dolls, you play with the truck. The child will adapt what it does because it wants to be, it wants affection, it wants unconditional love. So children have the capacity to adapt their behavior and do as the environment asks of them or demands. Now, what we do know, and that's why I'm clarifying that, is because some trans kids only come out, like, say, when they're 8 or when they're 11 or when they're 12. And those are the kids often that, depending on where they're on the spectrum, they were able to, for a period of time, repress what they naturally felt and did as their social context was socializing them to do. And you know what, you know, South African families can be like. Oh, yeah. Parents are very disciplinarian, it's, you know. Yeah. But then there are kids where already at the age of 2 to 3, because of where they're on that gender spectrum, it is just so far from how they naturally are that you'll have 2 to 3-year-olds already saying, but mommy, I'm not a boy. I know, you know, and there's so many of those narratives, you know, things like, but mommy, God made a mistake. I'm not a girl, I'm a boy, or whatever, in whichever direction it may be. So trans kids can start articulating that their gender identity is not matching how their family is seeing them as early as age 2 or 3. Now, this is where it gets controversial. So the WPATH Standards of Care says, if a and this is the thing I need to please emphasize this, and I hope, you know, your listeners hear this, because this is where the controversy is. It says, if a child is properly assessed and found to be and meets the criteria of being a trans child, social transition is recommended. Now, and that's, yeah, let me just highlight. We know that all children experiment with gender. There's a normal gender experimentation. And I often joke, every now and then I get a panic where a mom phones me and says, my son came walking down the passage today in my high heels and it looked like he liked it. Does it mean he's trans? To which I need to say, mommy, calm down. Your son just enjoyed wearing your shoes today. Yeah. You know, or a mom gets to the creche and picks up a daughter and she's in the, you know, Superman suit playing in the tree with the boys. And she comes to me, oh my God, is my child trans? No. Kids experiment and explore, and there's a wide spectrum of that. The people that get all up in arms, they kind of thinking we're like just transitioning anyone and everyone. If any child just slightly shows something that's not typical, we're labeling them trans and we're transitioning them. And that's where the misconception is. Okay. So a trans child, and this is the shorthand, we're talking about children that persistently, insistently, and consistently for a period of time articulate and say that they are not the gender that they've been assigned. And there's clear indication that that child is becoming distressed. You know, children act out, they become aggressive, they become socially withdrawn. You can see this child is suffering. Right. Those are the children we are talking about.
Okay.
And other than them, there are thousands of kids that are playing dress up and are, you know, are not typically the gender stereotype of them. And you can have some boys that are a little bit more feminine and little girls that are tomboys. All of that is not what we are talking about. But that's what the fear mongers are saying. You know, we are wanting to transition everyone. That's just slightly different. So
Yeah.
that's important.
So,
So for the appropriately assessed transgender kids, the WPATH Standards of Care recommends that we do social transition. And guys, nothing permanent is being done here. The
okay.
social transition means normally we start in the family for a period of time only at home. And then we'll expand it to like extended family. And then we'll expand it to some friends in the neighborhood. We don't go from today you're a transgender child, in a week's time we're negotiating you to be at your school as a boy or a girl. So social transition then means we let the child live in the gender they identify themselves to be. So they may then, we use the appropriate pronouns. So if it's a biological boy who says she's a girl, we'll start using she. They will choose a female name. They'll get to have female, dress in female clothes. And they will then be interacted and related with as the gender.
Right.
If that persists long enough, we will then recommend that they socially transition at school as well, meaning they then get to go to school as the boy or the girl they experience themselves to be. Nothing permanent. At any point,
I think,
if this child says,
yeah.
okay, now that I've done this, actually not,
I think that's
then
where the misconception comes in, and
perception comes.
someone like
Absolutely.
I got into an argument with somebody on social media, which is actually why I started the podcast, is to sort of educate myself and educate others, hopefully at the same time. I think people think that it's permanent. So when you hear
Yeah.
about a 9-year-old boy who inside is actually a girl, and then you'd think of the scalpel coming. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's a
Not
big
at all, nowhere near it.
okay.
So they get, if they're identified as a child, they socially transition. Then when puberty starts, nothing, we haven't done anything. They've just socially transitioned. But let's say they get to puberty now, and they're still comfortably identifying as that gender that they identified as. When they get to Tanner stage 2, I think there's 5 or 6 stages in the Tanner stages of puberty. When
Okay.
they get to Tanner stage 2, and the team that's assessed the child says there's no questioning, there's no doubting here, what they will do then is they will do puberty pausing. And this is the other controversy. That you're giving children hormone treatment. No. The puberty pausing medication is a medication that all it does is it basically just pauses puberty. And this is like age 12, 13, whenever, the boys or girls are getting there. And they now just get to continue living as the boy or the girl they identify to be. If in that adolescent period of time, up until the age of 16, they change for some reason, they go, okay, now, I'm actually feeling a bit more of, I've lived the girl, but actually I'm realizing there's still, there's some masculine, whatever. Then all they do is they stop the puberty pausing. Puberty kicks in and it will catch up.
Okay.
Nothing permanent has happened.
All
When
right.
they get to 16, what we will do is, because we know 16 is a very vulnerable age around your peers. What we will do for the trans boys is we'll give them a low dose of testosterone. So they get a bit of the deepening of the voice. But now there's been years that this young person has shown no signs at any point of, changing their mind or not, consistently and persistently identifying as the gender that they've now been living for, often then for many, many years. So we'll give the boys a little bit of testosterone for that, so they can, have a bit of bum fluff on their face so they can be comfortable amongst their peers. And for the trans girls, we will then give them low doses of estrogen, so they have a little bit of breast budding and the softening of their skin. According to the and then that at 16, only when you are 18 years old do we then, if you are then still, okay, nothing has changed, I am the girl I am the man I am, will we then introduce the more permanent changes, which is your gender affirming hormone treatment and your gender affirming surgeries, and they are adults.
Yeah.
They are making informed consent choices for themselves. Up until that point, what we've been doing is offering a supportive, affirming, safe experience and space for the children and the adolescents to figure out and live and come to an understanding that this is definitely who they are. Now, why I'm also highlighting, we spoke about detransitioners and I spoke about the spectrum. So a lot of and remember I said they're less than 1%. What you will find for amongst detransitioners, so if you're born a boy and you notice that your gender identity is different to what you've been assigned, and there's the feminine, for example, within it, that's going to be highlighted. So you're going to transition, say, for example, and start living as a girl. Now, once you've lived as a girl long enough, and it's no longer something that's being resisted or you're being stopped from doing, you've now comfortably explored the full expression of the feminine aspect of your gender identity. You may then find, because you may be not completely on the other end of the spectrum, now you come to a place where you can now, because this is no longer a source of anxiety and something that you have to fight for, you're now open to maybe discovering, well, actually, I'm somewhere else on the spectrum. And now I can acknowledge that there's elements of the masculine that I can now embrace. And actually, I'm somewhere on the gender non-binary part of the spectrum. And that's also what happens among some of the people who they transition in a particular direction, and then they may alter that until they find themselves where on the spectrum they actually are, which then people don't understand. They go, oh, they changed their mind, they made a mistake. There's many people that have altered their gender transition journey because they've come to a deeper, more fuller, more comprehensive understanding of what their gender identity is, and then have made the needed tweaks to that. And they are also within themselves absolutely happy.
And I think it's important.
This thing is about being authentic self. Yeah.
Exactly, and I think it's important for them to have the freedom to express themselves and be their authentic selves, and that's really what I want for them.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for articulating that so well. I think.
Well, my pleasure, and thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, you really did explain it very well, and I do appreciate that. Just before we wrap up, do you want to talk about the Triangle Project a bit more? Because you mentioned it earlier, but I'm just not 100% sure what they do.
Sure. So I think maybe that's a good place to go. So what resources exist? Because I think that's an important thing with this kind of topic. So just to say, I think we're very privileged being in Cape Town. Cape Town is often referred to as kind of the transgender mecca of the entire continent, meaning this is the one place where we have at least a significant concentration of services for trans people. So we can talk about that at another time. So there's still a lot of advocacy that has to happen to promote access to trans affirming healthcare in Africa. So in Cape Town, we have the Triangle Project. So Triangle Project is an LGBTQIA not-for-profit organization, the oldest. And so they have a clinical services or a health services service where there are volunteer doctors and nurses and therapists, where if you're dealing with whether it's your sexual orientation or your gender identity, you can access therapeutic services as well as some medical services. And it's not, and if and for a lot of the clients it's free. If you do have an income and you can make a contribution, they will ask for you to make a contribution. But if you're unemployed, you're a student, you have I think it's an income below 3,000, then the service is free. So there's no obstacle to the service. So they offer the health services. They also do a lot of community outreach where they're creating safe spaces in various communities where, being LGBTQI can get you killed, can get you corrective raped, can get you murdered, can get you thrown out of your family and your community. So they're doing a lot of outreach in various obviously our more lower socioeconomic communities where there's no resources. So
Right.
there's community outreach, and then they're also involved in a lot of advocacy around fighting for the rights of LGBTQIA people of the country, and they work together with organizations on the continent as well. Then there's Gender Dynamics, which is another NPO also based here in Cape Town. So Gender Dynamics is an organization that's specifically for transgender persons and people, transgender and gender non-conforming. So Gender Dynamics is primarily an advocacy organization. So the head of Liberty Matesa, she's the director at the moment of Gender Dynamics, and she's a trans woman. Most of the staff now are actually trans persons themselves, and they're engaged. So for example, they will be dealing with the prison services and fighting for the rights of trans people in prisons, because we had a case recently this year where they put a trans woman in a men's prison and refused her access to her hormones. So we fought that case and we won the case, and she got moved. She got her makeup back, she got her medication, and she's now in a woman's prison. They deal with advocacy with the police services, for example, because we have a, you know, within the sex worker industry, there's also trans sex workers, and they often face severe discrimination through police officers who arrest them and rape them and take their stuff from them. So they do a lot of work kind of sensitizing the police services about, you know, appropriate way of, you know, dealing with law, but, you know, respecting a person's, you know, dignity as a trans woman. They're often challenging the Department of Home Affairs, because even though we have the Alteration of Sex Status Act, we still have cases where trans people go to Home Affairs to give in their forms, and they literally see a staff member throw their forms in a bin, or tell them, oh no, this can't happen, there's no such thing, you can't change your sex, what you're talking about. So they do a lot of advocacy and training, for example, with organizations like that. Okay. I've been involved with them. We're presently looking at both the Western Cape and the Department of Education nationally to get a policy document for the transgender learner in schools. Because presently you still have to negotiate with every school. It depends who the principal is, who the governing body members are, etc. So that's that kind of advocacy work. So we're trying to get a national policy that guides all schools so that we can protect the rights of transgender learners in schools. Then the third to know about is at Groote Schuur Hospital, we have the transgender clinic. I'm a member of the multidisciplinary team there. And so these are for our transgender clients. So money shouldn't be an obstacle. We can refer you to the transgender clinic at Groote Schuur Hospital, where after you're seen, you can be referred to the endocrinology department, where you can be placed on your hormone treatment. And we can then send you to a plastic surgeon, and you get placed on the list for gender affirming surgery, which it's wonderful that exists, but just to say that at the moment, there's only 4 surgeries a year. So the waiting list for surgery is 25 years. So still a lot of work around, you know, expanding healthcare services for the trans community still needs to happen. But at least we have that clinic. We have those 2 organizations. Dr. Simon Pickstone Taylor at the Child and Family Unit of the Red Cross Children's Hospital has started a clinic for trans children and youth, where he sees children and adolescents as well. And they have a support group for trans adolescents, and they have a support group for the parents of trans youth as well, the parents of trans youth as well. So those are, I think, probably the primary services that exist in the Western Cape.
Ron, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for educating me. I really do appreciate it. I'm sure the listeners.
Absolutely. Thank you, pleasure, and thank you for making your platform available and acknowledging this as an important topic, and an important topic that requires conversation.
It really is an important topic. I think for me, human rights is number one, and I think you know, it's such a broad topic, but this is such an important topic within human rights. I do appreciate it, and I look forward to having you back.
Pleasure. I look forward to it myself. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
You too. Cheers, Ron.